Hello boys, girls. Welcome to our second Flip Classroom video. This time it's about Chapter 2, the Stone Ages and Early Cultures, and within Chapter 2, Section 1, the First People. If you have your textbook with you and you want to use it during this video, you can open it on page 28 and you can read along with this presentation. Just like last time, I want to start with a small introduction. Every section will start with a main idea, and in this case 4 main ideas, 4 bullet points that will explain to you very shortly about what we're going to talk in this section. Also, you will find always a list of key terms, and in this case the key terms get a little bit more difficult than last chapter perhaps, but perhaps not. So you can look them up in your textbook at the pages that are marked behind each key term. Also, I put there the link hmhsocialstudies.com. This is a link that you can log into for your ebooks. So if you forgot your textbook at home, you can still use your ebooks to investigate or make your homework. But also there are nice tools to watch videos or interactive quizzes or maps. And even there's a tool so you can make notes online in a graphic organizer. But still, for now, I also want you to make notes in your notebook. Okay, so before we continue, be sure you have your notebook with you and you can make some notes during this video. I will be checking them in class. Okay, over here you will see a timeline. And this timeline can be a little bit confusing because there are a lot of arrows and a lot of numbers and years and a lot of illustrating pictures. You will see a Catholic priest or something. You can see even a picture of the Simpsons, but on the other way you can see a dinosaur and a meteor striking the earth and people evolving and all of that. So to understand everything in history, we cut history up in small pieces and all giving them different titles. We're going to do the same thing, and people or historians or anybody actually started with 2 different chapters. A time before people could write and a time after people could write. And we call the time before people could write prehistory. Prehistory is a time before writing. In the chapter before, we already discussed about the clues and the artifacts that people used to learn about history when there wasn't any writing yet. This is the time that we call prehistory. Later, when we did have writing and we invented writing, it was easier for people to learn about history because other people already written it down. But in the prehistory, we didn't have any writing yet. Also, 2 names that we need to remember is hominid, and these are early ancestor of humans, and then also ancestor itself. What is that? Maybe you discuss that now and then with your family even, I don't know. But an ancestor is a relative who lived in the past. So these 3 words we're going to use during this chapter a lot. Now you know them. Also copied from your book is this picture. You can look it up on page 29, and hopefully you know what kind of continent we see in this map. What do you think? Well, if you look very closely, it's already named or labeled in the center of this continent. It's called Africa. And although people mostly mention Africa like a country, it is actually a continent. Just like America is not only United States, but it's all of those countries over there. And just like Europe is not only Europe, but it's also caught up in countries. And that's why also Africa is not a country, but a continent, because it is filled with other kinds of countries. Well, why we start with Africa? That is because a lot of people think that the first people we know as we know them are found or started in Africa. And 2 very famous people that helped learning about them and helped understanding all of that were these 2 people over here. The first one is the woman on the down part of the picture, the lower picture, and I hope I pronounced it good, Mary Leakey. And she's very famous because in 1959 She found bones in East Africa that were more than 1.5 million years old. She and her husband, they believe that the bones belong to an early hominid. And we just discussed what hominids are. They believe that they belong to a people with a very difficult name. We call them Australopithecus. A little bit later on we're going to discuss about what it actually means. The guy above her is called Donald Johanson, and he's famous for also finding early bones, but then even older, maybe even over the 3 million years old. And a very famous skeleton that he found is called Lucy, and she's like a symbol of, well, the first people, or at least the oldest people we found. And that's all happened in East Africa. So that's why we believe that the first people walking around here on the Earth planet millions of years ago are started in Africa. Well, a smart timeline. The higher you go up, the farther we go into history. The lower you go on this arrow, the closer we get at today. We start out with that very difficult word, Australopithecus. We're going to talk about a little bit later on more about it, but they started out being here on Earth 4 to 5 million years ago, and they came up with that by studying those bones they found. They can come up with that by looking at them very closely. 3 million years ago, people developed into what we call the Homo habilis, or the handyman. Why we call him the handyman, we're going to discuss that later on as well. 1.5 million years ago, people developed into what we call the Homo erectus. And maybe you already know what Homo erectus means, but it has to do with standing up straight. And then very close, well, figuratively speaking, very close, 200 years ago, we developed into the Homo sapiens, and that's also what we are now today. So if we talk about humans like we are now in the 2000 year after the birth of Christ, we are still Homo sapiens. And that's what we call also the smart people. A little bit more about that you can find also in your textbook on page 30 and page 31. There's a lot of text in this textbook about these people, but in these pictures they're nicely summarized. 4 major groups of hominids appeared in Africa between 5 million and 200,000 years ago. Each group was more advanced than the one before, so you can actually see very good the evaluation in it. The discussion is a little bit, especially within the religious zones and within people that go to church, if this is the proof that God does not exist, or as we believe that God does exist, but maybe the whole evaluation and development of people is part of his creation. So it started out 4 to 5 million years ago with the Australopithecus, also called the southern ape. He was different than everything before because he could stood upright and he could walk on 2 legs. A nice way of seeing that later on we call ourselves smart people is the fact that its brain was 1/3 of the size as we are having now. Later on, a couple of millions later, people developed into the Homo habilis. And a nice thing that you can see in this picture is the fact that it has a tool in there, while the first one didn't. Well, that's also one of the differences. Homo habilis started using stone tools for chopping and scraping, and that's also why we call it the Stone Age. Later on, 2 to 1.5 million years ago, we changed into what we call the Homo erectus, or his nickname is the upright man. And once again you can see the development of tools as well. Now it's not only a hand-hold piece of rock, but it's developed into a sharp hand axe. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. So they learn how to control fire, and they also used stone tools like this hand axe in this picture. Also, what is different from Homo erectus with the earlier ones is that they migrated out of Africa into Asia and Europe, something we're going to discuss next week. And then we come up with the Homo sapiens. They appeared in Africa about 200,000 years ago, and they're the same species as what we are now, as the modern human being. Also, they migrated around the world after being in Asia and Europe, and the nickname of the Homo sapiens is wise man. As you can see, the difference between the tools. Something else they developed is language. They came up with communication with each other. More you can find in these two pages, page 30 and 31. Let's continue with our third part, the Stone Age tools, because now we know the difference between the people, but also tools developed. First, we need to know what a tool is. Well, a tool is a handheld object that has been modified to help a person accomplish a task. And also I discussed about the different kind of cut-ups that we have in history, and we can label them all with different kind of titles so we can understand in what part we are. Well, the Stone Age we cut up in two parts as well. One is the Old Stone Age, and later we go to the New Stone Age. Well, now in the Old Stone Age we came up with a very difficult word. It's called the Paleolithic era. An era is a period of time, and this is called the Paleolithic era. So that's the first part of the Stone Age, or in other words, the Old Stone Age. Well, those tools, they developed a little bit. Maybe you can press pause at this moment and read about how these tools developed from a handhold piece up till that it's a very sharp finished hand axe. The same you can find also on the pages 30 and 31 in your textbook. Then our last part is about the hunter-gatherer society. On page 32 you can see a very nice drawing about hunter-gatherers' life, and they're talking about hunting and art and tools, fire, and even gathering. But before we continue talking about this, you need to know the difference between different societies. So what is actually a society? A society is a community of people who share a common culture. Wait, culture, we know that one. We learned that in chapter 1. If you don't remember anymore, look it up in your notes, because it's important to remember what is a culture again. So society is a community of people who share a common culture. Hunter-gatherers, well, the title already explains to you a little bit what it is. Those are people who hunt and gather. Men mostly hunted animals, while women and children mostly stayed at home. Well, what can you call at home? When it started raining, they went for shelter into caves if it was there. But women, they went gathering wild plants, seeds, fruits, and even nuts so they could survive. So they gathered their food. That's the difference. And we call them hunter-gatherers. Very easy to remember. What did they develop? Because they're so famous, they're so important, because they developed a lot of things. Well, most important one is language. And we still try to figure out why did they develop language. There are different kind of theories. I'm going to talk about 3 now very fast. One of them is because they believe that it helped them work together hunting animals. Another one could be so they could create relationships with each other. And the last one is that some people think language was very important and made it easier for people to resolve issues like how to distribute food, so how to divide food among people. Also, they developed art. They started making pictures into caves wall paintings, but also sculptures. People believe that they did that because they could teach each other about hunting. But they're not very sure about that, why they developed art. And last one is religion. They don't know exactly if we had religion, but they found different kind of graves with food in it and artifacts. So many scientists think that these discoveries are proof that the first human religions developed during the Stone Ages. So far for section 1. Next week we're going to talk about the early human migration. If you have any questions, please write them down and bring them to class so we can discuss them. See you next week.